Imagine, if you will, discovering that one of the most famous, revered family names in all of human history is, biologically speaking, a complete lie. In 2023, modern genomic scientists took a 200-year-old lock of hair belonging to a man whose name is practically synonymous with the word genius, and they ran a full DNA sequence. What they found sent absolute shockwaves through both the historical and the scientific communities. The Y chromosome that they extracted from that historical hair simply did not match any of the living descendants of his family lineage. None of them. Sometime between 1572 and 1770, an extra-pair paternity event occurred in his family tree. Biologically, genetically, this man was not who history thought he was. But as startling as that 21st century forensic revelation is, it is really just the final, lingering mystery in the agonizing, triumphant, and utterly chaotic life of Ludwig van Beethoven. Welcome to Legendary Lives Unveiled. If you are captivated by the profound tragedies and hidden truths that forge human greatness, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Today, our goal is to shatter the marble bust of the scowling genius that you see sitting on top of grand pianos everywhere. We want to uncover the deeply flawed, physically tortured, and astonishingly resilient human being underneath all that myth. To understand the rebel he became, we must travel back to Bonn, Germany in 1770. His father, Johann, was a court musician, a singer, but according to historical sources, Johann was also a severe alcoholic who had a very specific, obsessive, and financially motivated goal. He wanted to manufacture a child prodigy to rival Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the shadow of Mozart, who had toured Europe as a child prodigy just a decade or so earlier, performing for kings and queens and bringing his family immense fame and money, was incredibly heavy. Johann looked at his young son, Ludwig, saw raw musical talent, and basically saw a winning lottery ticket. He wanted that Mozart money for the van Beethoven family. The methods he used to extract this genius from young Ludwig were nothing short of brutal. The sources describe a level of abuse that is genuinely difficult to read about. Ludwig was forced to practice the clavier, an early keyboard instrument, and the violin for hours on end, often late into the night. One account details how Johann would come home from the tavern completely drunk, wake the boy up in the middle of the night, drag him out of bed, and force him to practice until dawn. We have to imagine the physical toll of small hands on freezing cold nights in an unheated house, exhausted, crying, and being forced to play complex finger exercises. If he made mistakes, he was beaten, or chillingly, locked in the cellar and abandoned in the dark. From a psychological perspective, this deeply abusive upbringing instilled two seemingly contradictory traits in Beethoven that would basically define his entire life. On one hand, it created a lifelong paranoia and a deep, visceral hatred of authority figures. He learned very early that those in power, starting with his own father, could be cruel, arbitrary, and very dangerous. But on the other hand, it forged an incredible, almost terrifying resilience, because he learned a very dark lesson. Survival was entirely conditional on his performance. If he played flawlessly, he avoided the cellar. He had to be excellent just to survive his own home. His mother, Maria Magdalena, is a heartbreaking figure in this story. She was the one source of warmth and actual, unconditional affection in his life, and he frequently referred to her as his best friend. She tried to buffer Johann's rage, but was also trapped in this incredibly abusive dynamic. Tragically, she died of consumption, what we now call tuberculosis, when Beethoven was just 16 years old. Overnight, he was forced into the role of the parentified child. His father was so incapacitated by alcoholism that he couldn't even hold down his job. It got so bad that Ludwig actually had to go to court and formally petition the Elector of Bonn, the ruler of the region, to have half of his father's salary paid directly to him, just so the family wouldn't starve. At 16, Ludwig became the sole provider, the financial manager, and the caretaker for his two younger brothers, Caspar and Johann. Carrying the financial survival of his family, the untreated trauma of severe physical abuse, and this crushing expectation of musical genius, he was in a complete psychological pressure cooker. It is no wonder that when he finally got a ticket out of there, he took it. In 1792, at the age of 21, he moved to Vienna, the center of the musical universe. Mozart had recently died, and the musical capital of the world was desperately looking for its next titan. The grand plan was for Beethoven to study under Joseph Haydn, the legendary father of the symphony. Count Waldstein, an early supporter, famously wrote a poetic send-off: "You shall receive Mozart's spirit from Haydn's hands." It sounds like a majestic passing of the musical torch, but the reality of the dynamic between the 22-year-old, trauma-hardened Beethoven and the 60-year-old, comfortably famous Haydn was a total mess. In Beethoven's own diary, where he meticulously tracked his expenses in Vienna, he wrote down Haydn 8 Groschen. Not only did he spell his legendary teacher's name wrong, but 8 Groschen was a tiny fee, the equivalent of maybe 24 cents today. Just a token sum Haydn charged his non-aristocratic students. Haydn was established and very busy preparing for a major trip to London. Beethoven, with a massive chip on his shoulder, deeply resented being a student, feeling he already knew how to compose. He quickly realized that Haydn was essentially phoning it in as a teacher. Beethoven was supposed to be doing rigorous counterpoint exercises, the complex mathematical puzzle of classical music, dictating how multiple independent melody lines weave together without clashing. He started to notice that Haydn wasn't even correcting his mistakes, just glancing at them and passing them. So, Beethoven secretly hired another teacher, a lesser-known composer named Johann Schenk. It was a brilliant, highly deceptive strategy. Schenk painstakingly corrected all the counterpoint homework, and then Beethoven took those flawless sheets, recopied them in his own handwriting, and handed the pristine work to Haydn. He was getting the rigorous education he needed while retaining the immense social and professional clout of being known all around Vienna as Haydn's star pupil. He wanted the brand name of Haydn without dealing with Haydn's actual lack of teaching, but the truth eventually came out in a profoundly humiliating way. Haydn finally caught on to Beethoven's arrogant attitude, calling him that great mogul, meaning he viewed him as a barbarian. Yet, trying to be a good guy, Haydn sent a letter back to the Elector in Bonn, including some of Beethoven's recent compositions, praising his progress and gently asking the Elector to increase Beethoven's stipend because the kid was broke. The Elector's reply was devastating. He wrote back saying he had already seen all this music. Beethoven had written these pieces before he even left for Vienna. Seeing no progress at all and fearing he was just racking up debt, the Elector completely cut off Beethoven's funding. Beethoven was completely busted. He had lied to Haydn about his income and lied about when he wrote the music, manipulating everyone. He self-sabotaged and alienated the most powerful men in his life because he didn't trust authority figures to take care of him, taking matters into his own hands deceitfully. But ironically, getting cut off forced him to become an independent freelancer. He secured his own aristocratic patrons, played in their salons, demanded to be treated as an equal, and defied his musical fathers to become his own man. He needed that independence because he was about to enter a period of profound isolation, his silent crucible, where no teacher, no patron, and no amount of money could help him. In his late 20s, as his career as a virtuoso pianist was exploding in Vienna, he started noticing something terrifying. It started with a loss of high frequencies. He couldn't hear the higher notes on the piano or the higher pitches of voices. This was accompanied by a relentless, unceasing tinnitus, a ringing and buzzing in his ears that wouldn't stop day or night. Imagine being a musician whose entire identity is inextricably tied to the perception of sound, and the very organ you rely on begins to rot from the inside out. By 1801, he wrote a heartbreaking letter to his childhood friend Franz Wegeler, admitting he had been completely avoiding society for 2 full years. He wrote, "I lead a wretched life. It is impossible for me to tell people that I am deaf." The shame was absolute. He believed that if the competitive musical world of Vienna found out, his career would be instantly over, a professional death sentence. This secret agony culminated in 1802 when his doctor sent him to the quiet countryside village of Heiligenstadt, hoping the silence would rest his ears and cure him. It didn't work. The silence only made the ringing louder. Isolated and despairing, he wrote the Heiligenstadt Testament, an unsent document addressed to his brothers that reads like a suicide note, crossed with a passionate artistic manifesto. It is one of the most agonizing, raw documents in all of musical history, explicitly stating he considered ending his own life. He wrote about the humiliation of standing next to someone who pointed out a flute playing in the distance, while he heard absolutely nothing. Pushed to the brink, he pulled back, writing, "It was only my art that held me back. It seemed impossible to leave the world until I had produced all that I felt called upon to produce." He made a conscious decision to endure unimaginable suffering for the sake of his art, to bid defiance to his fate. The physical adaptations he made to continue working as his hearing deteriorated are wild. He started using ear pipes, clunky brass hearing aids he would physically hold to his ear. He had an inventor attach a large, wooden, megaphone-like projection box to the top of his piano to funnel sound directly toward his face. Most incredibly, accounts detail him holding a wooden stick in his teeth, biting down on it, pressing the other end against the soundboard of the piano, and feeling the vibrations travel through the stick and into his jawbone. This utilized the exact same scientific principle of bone conduction used in modern headphones today. Bypassing his damaged eardrums entirely, he sent acoustic vibrations directly to his inner ear through his skeletal structure. He was literally hacking his own anatomy. As a modern, Grammy Award-winning classical percussionist proposed, he didn't just lose his sense, he actively retrained his entire body to act as a giant ear. When critics talk about the violence of Beethoven's middle period, the pounding chords, and the sheer physical force required to play it, to the point where he was notoriously snapping the strings on his pianos, it wasn't just aggressive emotion. He was hitting the keys harder so he could physically feel it. It was a physical byproduct of him striking the keys with enough force so that the vibrations could course through the floorboards, up through his chair, into his body, and directly into his consciousness. The tactile, physical sensation of the music became just as important as the auditory sound in the air. But while his failing body forced him to feel the literal weight of his notes, the despair he conquered in that quiet village was about to be unleashed outward, forever destroying the polite boundaries of classical music and ushering in an era of monumental, untamed heroism. This physiological crisis absolutely birthed what historians call his heroic middle period. He took all that rage and despair from the Heiligenstadt Testament and channeled it into music of monumental scale. The prime example here is the Third Symphony, the Eroica, the piece that definitively shattered the polite boundaries of the classical symphony. It was longer than anything that came before it, vastly more complex, emotionally turbulent, and massive. Based purely on the historical accounts, Beethoven originally dedicated the Eroica Symphony to Napoleon Bonaparte. In the early 1800s, Beethoven saw Napoleon as the ultimate hero, the living embodiment of the French Revolution's democratic ideals, a champion of the common man who was tearing down the corrupt monarchies of Europe. But then, in 1804, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and crowned himself Emperor of the French. When Beethoven heard this news, accounts say he flew into an absolute rage, feeling entirely betrayed. He felt Napoleon had betrayed the cause of human rights to become just another power-hungry tyrant. He marched over to the title page of his manuscript, which had Bonaparte proudly written at the top, and scratched the name out so furiously with his pen that he actually tore a hole straight through the thick paper. He renamed the piece Eroica, stating it was composed to celebrate the memory of a great man, meaning the hero Napoleon used to be before he became a dictator. It perfectly encapsulates Beethoven's heroic ideal, the unrelenting struggle against tyranny, whether that tyranny is a political dictator marching across Europe or his own failing body holding his genius hostage. You see this exact same theme of overcoming oppression dominate his only opera, Fidelio. He agonized over this work, taking years to finish it and writing 4 different overtures because he simply couldn't get it right. The intense plot follows a woman named Leonore, who disguises herself as a male prison guard named Fidelio to infiltrate a dark political dungeon. She is there to rescue her unjustly imprisoned husband, Florestan, who is being slowly starved to death by a corrupt governor. If we connect this narrative to his psychology, Fidelio is a massive projection of his deepest unmet desires. He longed for justice and freedom from arbitrary oppression. But more intimately, on a human level, he deeply longed for what he called conjugal love. He wanted a partner who was so fiercely loyal and profoundly devoted that she would literally descend into a dark dungeon to save him. This marks the definitive shift in Western art from the classical era to the Romantic era. In the classical era, composers largely wrote outward. Their music had to be elegant, balanced, and socially acceptable background music to entertain aristocrats and please the court. But because Beethoven was physically and socially isolated by his deafness, he literally couldn't hear the outside world anymore. So his entire auditory world was forced inward. He stopped listening to the world and started listening to himself. He stopped writing what sounded pretty to Viennese society and started writing raw, unfiltered human emotion, the sound of his own internal landscape, his terror, his joy, and his fury. The music became universally, intimately human, accessing depths of sorrow and peaks of triumph that polite, courtly music simply never dared to touch. He was pouring his soul out into these massive symphonies, preaching universal brotherhood, heroic love, and triumph over despair. But the tragic irony is that his actual personal heart, his real-life chance at love, was locked away in a secret drawer, hoarding a very private grief. This brings us to the great unsolved mystery of the immortal beloved, a case of pure historical true crime. In March 1827, just after Beethoven died, his secretary was going through his cluttered apartment looking for important documents. He found a secret drawer hidden in a wooden cabinet containing some bank shares, a picture of a woman, and a 10-page unsent love letter written in pencil. It was dated only July 6th and July 7th, didn't specify the year, and crucially, didn't name the woman. It addressed her with incredibly passionate monikers: my angel, my all, my own self, and ended with the famous sign-off, ever thine, ever mine, ever us. The tone was breathless and intense, writing about the agony of their physical separation. He literally wrote, "I can only live either wholly with you or not at all." The language of two people who had already confessed their love and were navigating an impossible situation. Decades later, historians analyzed the watermarks on the specific paper, cross-referenced his travel logs and police registries, and definitively proved the letter was written in 1812 from the spa town of Teplitz in Bohemia. So, treating this like a suspect board, suspect number 1 is often Julie Guicciardi, the young countess he famously dedicated the Moonlight Sonata to. He was deeply infatuated with her back in 1801, 11 years prior to the letter. However, modern scholars widely dismiss her as a serious candidate for the 1812 letter. She was known to be a bit of a flirt and ended up marrying a count, but crucially, Beethoven later admitted to his secretary that when Julie came back to him years later, crying because her marriage was failing, he flatly scorned her. The timeline doesn't fit, and the emotional tone of mutual desperate devotion in the letter completely contradicts his cold, dismissive attitude toward Julie. Suspect number 2 is Antony Brentano, a massive theory championed by a famous Beethoven biographer in the 1970s. Antony was a serious intellectual woman in Prague at the exact right time in 1812, and he later dedicated the massive Diabelli variations to her. But the glaring issue is that Antony was happily married to Franz Brentano, who was one of Beethoven's closest personal friends and his most trusted financial advisor. Psychological profiling makes this impossible. Beethoven had a strict, almost puritanical moral code regarding marriage, fidelity, and personal honor. The idea that he would attempt a clandestine ménage à trois and elope with the pregnant wife of his close friend and benefactor makes absolutely no psychological sense, as he judged others harshly for moral failings and wouldn't commit the ultimate betrayal against a friend, which leaves the strongest candidate according to modern musicologists, Josephine von Brunswick. The paper trail is overwhelming, with 13 other deeply passionate love letters written to Josephine between 1804 and 1809. She was a young widow, and they were undeniably in love, with him calling her his only beloved. However, her aristocratic family pressured her to marry Baron von Stackelberg to secure her social and financial status. The marriage to Stackelberg was disastrous. He was emotionally abusive, ruined her finances, and destroyed her health. The forensic detail that shatters this case lies in Beethoven's infamously messy, practically illegible handwriting. For decades, researchers thought a scribble in the letter referred to a location or person, starting with the letter A. But a modern analysis pointed out a copyist likely misread the scribbles. It wasn't an A, it was Saint for Stackelberg. Beethoven was ranting about how things were ruined and directly blaming the terrible husband standing in their way. Furthermore, exactly 9 months after the July 1812 letter, Josephine, whose husband had been away for months, gave birth to a daughter named Minona. Many historians heavily suspect Minona was Beethoven's biological child, especially since Minona spelled backward is anonym, anonymous, like a hidden, haunting confession in the child's name. Why didn't they end up together? The crushing weight of 19th century class structures crashed down on them. Josephine was a noblewoman, while Beethoven, despite his genius, was a commoner without a title. Under strict Austrian Empire laws, if a noble widow married a commoner, she automatically lost legal custody of her aristocratic children from her first marriage. The state would take them away entirely, forcing her to choose between the love of her life and her own children. Like any mother, she chose her children. Her sister later wrote a heartbreaking diary entry. Mother's love determined her to renounce her own happiness. Knowing it was futile, or perhaps receiving word she couldn't go through with the elopement. Beethoven left the most profound, soul-bearing letter of his life unsent. He folded it up, hid it in a secret drawer, and kept it as a relic of a life and family permanently denied to him until the day he died. The devastating heartbreak and total loss of a traditional family created a massive psychological void within him. Unfortunately, trauma that goes unprocessed often turns malignant. That immense paternal void mutated into something incredibly dark and obsessive, pointing all that pent-up desire directly at the nearest available target, his 9-year-old nephew, Karl. This brings us to the absolute darkest chapter of his life, the custody battle for Karl. If the unsent letter shows his tenderness, this battle reveals him at his most toxic, paranoid, and destructive. In 1815, his brother Caspar died of tuberculosis. On his deathbed, Caspar explicitly wrote a will naming his wife Johanna and Ludwig as co-guardians, wanting them to raise the boy together. Beethoven utterly refused, using his overbearing influence to force the dying man to physically alter the will, literally crossing out Johanna's name so he could demand sole custody. He launched a brutal 5-year legal war dragging through Vienna's courts, unleashing vicious attacks on Johanna, calling her poisonous, an adulteress, and a bestial woman unfit to raise her son. While Johanna had a prior criminal conviction for embezzlement regarding a stolen pearl necklace, Beethoven's hatred was an obsession bordering on the insane. He essentially wanted to erase her from existence and rewrite reality to claim Karl entirely. The hypocrisy was staggering. During this exact period, he was sketching the Ninth Symphony and the Ode to Joy, a massive utopian vision of universal brotherhood and perfect harmony. Simultaneously, he waged a scorched earth courtroom campaign to destroy a mother. He conceived of perfect love for humanity in the abstract, but interpersonally, he was dictatorial and undeniably cruel. Utilizing high nobility connections to bypass common courts, he won sole custody in 1820, but it was a total disaster for the boy. A judge noted Karl was tossed back and forth like a ball. Beethoven was an obsessively overbearing guardian, smothering Karl and demanding he become an academic genius and musical prodigy. He subconsciously repeated the classic cycle of abuse, attempting to do to Karl exactly what his father had done to him in Bonn. He forced Karl into lessons with a famous former pupil, and when that teacher honestly reported the boy had absolutely no musical talent, Beethoven flat out refused to believe it. He lived in total denial, convinced his sheer will could force the boy to be a genius. Exerting godlike control, he approached raising Karl exactly like a musical composition, literally trying to compose a human being and failing entirely to realize a traumatized child cannot be erased and rewritten like sheet music. The pressure broke Karl. In July 1826, the 19-year-old suffocated under his uncle's control and decided to kill himself. He pawned his watch to buy a second pistol, to be absolutely sure, climbed to the remote ruins of Castle Rauenstein, loaded both guns with gunpowder and lead balls, pointed the first at his head, and pulled the trigger. It misfired, or missed. He aimed the second pistol and fired. The bullet grazed his skull, carving a deep groove in his temple without penetrating the brain casing. Found bleeding by a wagon driver the next day, Karl had one desperate request. He begged to be taken to his mother's house and absolutely refused to be taken to his uncle Beethoven's apartment. When police investigated, Karl gave a devastating quote summarizing the tragedy. "I became worse because my uncle wanted me to be better." It was a chilling indictment of a suffocating, toxic love. This suicide attempt completely broke Beethoven, forcing him to realize it was the one thing he couldn't control. He finally let go, allowing Karl to join the army and gain independence. But the sheer emotional heartbreak and public humiliation acted as a physical trigger, and almost immediately after Karl left, Beethoven's ailing body began a rapid, catastrophic collapse. The darkest mysteries of his physical destruction were just beginning to unfold. The descriptions of Beethoven's final months in late 1826 and early 1827 are incredibly grim. He was completely bedridden and suffering from severe jaundice, his skin and eyes turning completely yellow. He was vomiting blood and developed dropsy, which is a massive, agonizing accumulation of fluid in the abdomen caused by liver failure. His stomach swelled up to an enormous size. We must remember that medical treatments of the 1820s were, by modern standards, completely barbaric. Doctors did not understand germ theory, and their interventions often did significantly more harm than good. To relieve the intense pressure in his swollen abdomen, a prominent surgeon actually punctured Beethoven's stomach 4 separate times. They had no anesthetic. They simply drove a hollow needle into his abdomen and drained out massive amounts of fluid, up to 14 liters at a time. Following this literal torture, his primary physician treated the puncture wounds to prevent infection. The substance he used to dress the open wounds was a toxic lead paste. This archaic medical tragedy leads us directly into modern DNA forensics. For decades, scientists believed Beethoven suffered from chronic lead poisoning his entire life, and that this poisoning might have caused his erratic behavior and even his deafness. This prevailing theory was based on chemical tests conducted in the year 2000 on a famous relic known as the Hiller lock. This lock of hair was supposedly snipped from Beethoven's head by a 15-year-old musician the day after the composer died. It served as the foundational piece of evidence for the lead poisoning narrative. However, a landmark 2023 genomic study completely upended this historical fact. Extracting DNA from a 2-century-old hair is incredibly difficult because hair shafts do not contain the nuclear DNA normally needed for a full genome sequence. Yet, modern technology allowed scientists to extract highly degraded fragments of DNA from the keratin in the hair shaft, utilizing massive computational power to piece those fragments together like a microscopic, shredded jigsaw puzzle. When researchers ran this advanced genomic sequencing on the famous Hiller lock, they discovered it did not belong to Beethoven at all. The DNA belonged to an unknown woman, likely a lock of hair belonging to the young musician's wife that simply got mixed up in a locket. Instantly, all historical medical theories based on that specific hair were totally invalidated, proving exactly how careful we must be with unverified historical relics. But the researchers possessed 5 other authenticated locks of Beethoven's hair, secured with solid chains of custody, tracing back to his closest friends. When they ran mass spectrometry on this authentic hair to identify chemical elements, they did find lead, so he was indeed poisoned. However, it was not a chronic, lifelong exposure. They found massive, acute spikes of lead concentration along the hair shaft. Because hair grows at a predictable rate, scientists mapped those spikes chronologically, and they correlated exactly with the precise dates that his primary physician applied the lead poultices to his stomach wounds. The medical treatment meant to heal his wounds actually poisoned him. This is known as iatrogenic lead poisoning, an illness caused directly by the doctor. The lead paste was absorbed directly into his bloodstream through the open puncture wounds, rapidly accelerating his already failing liver. The doctor accidentally killed him faster, but the liver was already failing before the lead paste was ever applied. The 2023 DNA sequencing revealed the true underlying culprits behind his death. The study found that Beethoven had a high genetic risk for liver disease encoded right into his DNA. He was biologically predisposed to cirrhosis. Furthermore, scientists found fragments of the hepatitis B virus in his hair, proving he had an active viral infection in his final months. When you combine a genetic predisposition for liver failure, a severe hepatitis B infection, and his well-documented heavy alcohol consumption, he drank about a bottle of wine per meal. And back then, cheap wine was sometimes sweetened with lead acetate. His liver simply stood no chance. On March 26, 1827, Beethoven finally died. A massive thunderstorm famously raged over Vienna that afternoon, with lightning striking just as he took his last breath. A fitting, dramatic exit for the maestro. His funeral was a massive civic event, with 20,000 people lining the streets of Vienna. To put that in perspective, that was half the population of the inner city at the time. Schools were closed, and the military had to be called in just to maintain crowd control. The next great composer, Franz Schubert, served as one of the torchbearers. A renowned actor read a powerful eulogy, written by a celebrated poet proclaiming, "He was an artist, but a man as well. He withdrew from mankind after he had given them his all and received nothing in return." But the final bombshell, the ultimate plot twist to a life we thought we understood, came long after the marble busts were carved. The 2023 researchers, having sequenced his true DNA, wanted to trace his lineage to complete the family tree and find living relatives. They compared the DNA from Beethoven's authenticated hair to the DNA of living men in Belgium who share the Van Beethoven last name, and traced their ancestry back through church records to the exact same 16th century ancestor, Ert van Beethoven. The Y chromosomes, which are passed virtually unchanged directly from father to son, did not match. Sometime in the family tree, between the conception of his ancestor Hendrik van Beethoven in Belgium around 1572 and the conception of Ludwig in Bonn in 1770, a woman in the family had a child with a man who was not a Van Beethoven. This extra-pair paternity event, combined with his own father's historically sketchy and missing baptismal records, points to a staggering truth. History's greatest composer, the titan of the Van Beethoven family, wasn't biologically a Van Beethoven at all. It is a profound, almost poetic irony. Think about the bigger picture of his entire life. His noble-sounding name with the Van that he used to try to gain custody of Karl in aristocratic courts, his musical lineage manufactured by his abusive father, his physical health, his dreams of a perfect family with Josephine, his desperate attempts to mold his nephew into a prodigy. Practically everything his personal identity was built upon was a fragile, cracking foundation. It was all, in some way, an illusion, a struggle, or a failure. Yet, from that absolute wreckage of a personal life, from the childhood abuse, the terrifying deafness, the toxic family dynamics, the poisoned liver, and the genetic secrets, he built monuments of sound. He took the sheer chaos and agony of his human experience and organized it into the most perfect, enduring, invincible structures imaginable. The symphonies, the late string quartets, the Missa Solemnis. He built something eternal out of a life that was constantly breaking apart. We set out to strip away the myth of the scowling marble bust, and what we found was something infinitely more compelling. We found an abused child who learned to survive by defying authority. We found a rebellious student who outgrew his masters. We found a deaf visionary who used the physics of his own bones to turn his disability into a new era of subjective, deeply emotional art. We found a tragic lover holding on to an unsent letter, and a toxic, overbearing father figure who nearly destroyed the nephew he claimed to love. And we found a medical marvel whose very DNA held secrets that managed to outlive him by 2 centuries. This leaves us with a lingering, uncomfortable question to ponder. If Beethoven were alive today, if modern medicine had cured his deafness, if modern therapy had healed his childhood trauma, helped him process his anger, and allowed him to build a healthy, functional family with the woman he truly loved, would he have been a happier man? Undoubtedly. He would have lived a much more peaceful life. But would we still have the Ninth Symphony? Does art that reaches the absolute stars fundamentally require a soul that has been dragged through the dark? That is the profound question you have to ask yourself the next time you hear that famous music. Is the transcendent beauty worth the human blood it costs to make it? If you enjoyed uncovering the deeply flawed, intensely human reality behind the myth today, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Legendary Lives Unveiled. Let us know down in the comments. Do you think his genius was inseparable from his suffering? Or could he have written masterpieces without the pain? Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.